In another video, we've shown that the science of ethics has everything to do with happiness. How is happiness achieved, and in what does happiness consist? In this video, we'll start by looking at what happiness is not, and then in other videos, we'll look at what happiness is. In other words, in this video, we're giving a negative account showing that certain things which people often mistakenly think are happiness are in fact not happiness. In another video, we'll show what positively is happiness. Just as rocks naturally fall towards the center of gravity and as trees naturally grow upwards as opposed to downwards, so too the human will by natural necessity moves towards happiness. There's no free choice about whether or not we will happiness. We necessarily do this because that's just the nature of the will to incline towards happiness. We cannot help but will to be happy. But what is happiness? Thomas Aquinas distinguishes between the notion or ratio of happiness and the concrete thing in which happiness is actually found or realized. People necessarily will happiness in the sense of the abstract notion of happiness, but not everyone agrees about the concrete reality in which happiness is realized or found. And so people don't all necessarily will that concrete reality in which happiness is actually found. So everyone necessarily wills the abstract notion of happiness. They necessarily will things under the aspect of bringing about happiness. But since not everyone agrees or knows the actual concrete thing in which happiness is found, not everyone actually wills the concrete thing in which they will actually become happy. Thus, many people are not happy, but miserable. That's because they don't know what happiness is. By analogy, Shakespeare's longest play can be considered either as an abstract notion, namely just the idea of the longest play written by Shakespeare, or as the concrete reality in which this longest play is written. So the concrete reality is the play Hamlet. So let's suppose that someone has an inclination to read Shakespeare's longest play. It's possible that you could have two people with this inclination, but one of them reads Romeo and Juliet and one reads Hamlet. The reason for the divergence is not because both are not inclined to read Shakespeare's longest play, but rather because one of them mistakenly thinks that his longest play is Romeo and Juliet. Now that person is in error because they don't realize which concrete reality in which the abstract notion they desire is found. They think the concrete reality in which Shakespeare's longest play is found is Romeo and Juliet, but really the concrete reality in which this play is found is Hamlet. So the person who wills to read Hamlet is the one who recognizes the actual concrete reality in which what he desires is found. So too, all humans necessarily, that is, by a natural necessity, move towards happiness as an abstract notion, but not all humans agree on the concrete reality in which happiness is found. Some humans are in error about this, and so many humans end up being miserable because they don't incline towards the concrete reality in which happiness is found, but rather some sort of fool's gold happiness. Now, to avoid falling for the trap of fool's gold happiness, we're going to enlist the aid of Boethius. Boethius was a Catholic Roman statesman and philosopher in the 6th century. His textbooks in arithmetic, music, and logic, and his translations of Aristotle were the basis for all cathedral school and university education for over 1,000 years in Western Europe. This is more or less equivalent to providing the standard textbook for all high school and university education in modern times. That's how important he is on Western civilization and education. After being accused of trying to overthrow the Ostrogoth king, Theodoric, Boethius was imprisoned and killed. According to one account, Boethius was killed by having a rope tied around his head and then squeezed until his eyes popped out. While awaiting this gruesome fate in prison, Boethius composed a book called The Consolation of Philosophy. In this book, he personifies Lady Philosophy as coming to him and instructing him about the true nature of happiness while he awaits his death. Along the way, Lady Philosophy shows Boethius that all the things he used to think constituted happiness, that is, all those concrete realities in which the notion of happiness he thought would be found, are in fact not concrete instances of happiness, but potential sources of misery. In the first part of the second part of Thomas Aquinas' magnum opus, the Summa Theologiae, which is called the Prima Secundae of the Summa Theologiae, Aquinas develops Boethius' proofs that those things in which most people think happiness is found are actually not the foundation for true happiness. The concrete things in which most people think that happiness is found are things like these: wealth, honor, fame or glory, power, and here we mean specifically political power or institutional power, health, that is, the good of the body. This could also include beauty, since that's also a bodily good. 6, pleasure, and finally virtue. Now, the first 4 of these, wealth, honor, fame or glory, and then power, are all called external goods, or goods of fortune, because they're external to the body. In contrast, health, beauty, and pleasure are all found internal to the body. Virtue is intrinsic to the soul. In this video, we'll go over Aquinas' arguments showing that the things listed above are not happiness. That is, they're not the true concrete realization of happiness. As we said before, all people necessarily incline towards the abstract notion of happiness, but many people are mistaken about where concretely that notion is found. They'll think that it's found in wealth, honor, fame or glory, power, health, pleasure, or virtue, but that's a mistake. In a later video, we'll have to give a positive account of what concretely happiness is, given that it is none of these things listed above. Now, St. Thomas, following Boethius, employs 2 basic argument forms to unmask these false notions of happiness. The first basic argument form is this: happiness is the perfect good. It should totally satisfy the will so that nothing further is desired. But the thing in question, which is thought to be happiness, does not totally satisfy the will. Therefore, the thing in question, whether it be pleasure, wealth, etc., is not in fact happiness. The second argument form is this: the thing which is thought to be happiness is good only in relation to something else. But happiness is the perfect good, so it is good not in relation to something else, but on its own account. Therefore, the thing which is thought to be happiness, pleasure, wealth, etc., is not in fact happiness. Now, Aquinas doesn't stick strictly to these argument forms, but knowing these 2 argument forms will be a good aid in figuring out the general thrust of most of Aquinas' arguments. Notice that these arguments do not aim to deny that the thing confused with happiness is itself some good. Pleasure, wealth, and honor are all good things, but they're not the perfect good. They're not happiness. They're not the ultimate end of life. And so the argument is not that these things aren't good or that they're intrinsically evil. No, the argument is that they're not happiness. They're not the perfect good. At the end of all this, we may wonder whether there is even such a thing as happiness. Perhaps we've set the bar too high, and it's simply impossible to find any concrete reality in which the fullness of happiness will be found. This question or doubt will be addressed in a later video. Okay, so now let's take the different fool's gold accounts of happiness and show that they aren't happiness. The first one is wealth. Happiness does not consist in wealth. Wealth, Aquinas says, can be understood in one of 2 ways. Either we're talking about artificial wealth, which is money, that is, coins, currency, etc., or we're talking about natural wealth. Here what we mean are things that are intrinsically useful, like water, land, clothing, a bed, a car. Now, artificial wealth is for the sake of natural wealth. The reason you want money is so that you could spend it on things which are useful, like water, land, a bed, or a car. But natural wealth is itself useful. That is, it's for something else. It's for other goods. For instance, water and food are for the good of hydration and bodily health, more generally. So these external goods like water and food are for the sake of an internal bodily good. Likewise, clothing is for the sake of bodily integrity against cold and heat, and it's also for social approval or honor. And so we see that artificial wealth is for the sake of natural wealth, and natural wealth is for the sake of other goods. So it cannot be the case that wealth is the ultimate good, the last end, since by nature, whether it's artificial wealth or natural wealth, it's ordered to some further good, which by definition will be more good than it. So wealth cannot be the ultimate good, that is, it cannot be happiness. Now let's look at the second option. Does happiness consist in honor? The answer is no, happiness does not consist in honor. The first argument to this effect is that honors are not in the one who is honored, but rather in the one doing the honoring. But happiness is in the one who is happy. Therefore, happiness is not honor. For instance, this man bowing as he ascends the stairs, he is the one giving honor to the king. Now, the honor given to the king is in the man doing the bowing, not in the king. But happiness, if the king is happy, is in the king, not in the man doing the bowing. So happiness and honor obviously cannot be the same thing since they're in different subjects. A second argument that honor is not happiness is this. First of all, someone is honored because they are good, but happiness is good on its own account, not on account of some prior good. Therefore, happiness is not honor. In other words, we give someone honor because they're already to a certain degree happy, or in a certain degree good. But that presupposes that there's a more fundamental good than honor. Honor is a reflection, at best, of happiness. It's not happiness itself. So now we've shown that neither wealth nor honor is happiness. But does happiness consist in fame or glory? The answer is again no. Fame and glory are not the concrete reality in which happiness is found. Now, you might wonder, how does fame or glory differ from honor? Aren't those the same thing? Here, we should note that fame or glory consists in being well known and praised by those who know you. So, there's two aspects here. Many people know you, and they praise you. They think or talk well of you. On the other hand, honor is a reward for excellence. For instance, if you're the best player on the championship soccer team, and as a result, everyone at school talks about how good you are, that is what we mean by fame or glory. On the other hand, if the school decides to put a picture of you next to your trophy in a public trophy case, that is an example of honor. So honor, fame, and glory are related to each other, but fame and glory on the one hand are not the same as honor on the other hand. Fame has to do with how people think and talk about you, but honor has to do with the external signs of reverence which are given as a prize. Now that we've seen the difference between fame and glory on the one hand and honor on the other hand, let's look at 3 reasons why fame or glory is not that in which happiness consists. The first reason is this. Fame is often false. For instance, when people praise those who don't actually deserve praise, that is, people who aren't actually good. But happiness is necessarily something good, whereas false praise seems to be something bad. Moreover, in human knowledge, we know something because it is true. Our knowing it does not make the thing itself true. Therefore, if people think and say you are good and they are right, that is because some more fundamental goodness which preceded and caused the fame that you have. So if fame is good, that is, because it's true, and you do deserve to be well known and praised, then that is because something else, namely what causes the fame, is even better. So, if you are intrinsically excellent, if you have all sorts of virtues, then you might deserve to be well known and praised. But then the praise is good precisely because there is some more fundamental goodness, namely your intrinsic excellence or virtues, which cause the praise to be good. But happiness is the fundamental good, the last end of the moral life, and so it cannot be the case that fame, which is consequent upon some other good, is happiness. The third argument is that people are often wrong about who they praise, and public opinion is frequently changed from being for someone to being against them. But happiness, since it is what satisfies the will, must be stable, not easily lost. So happiness cannot consist in fame, which is so easily lost and changed with fortune. So happiness, we've seen, does not consist in honor, or in wealth, or in fame/glory. Does it consist in power? Here we mean political power, so the ability to control other people either within a complete civil society, political regime such as the United States, or within a smaller institution such as a university or a business or the post office. Does happiness consist in power? The first argument that it does not consist in power is this: happiness is the perfect good which satisfies the will. But power is not the perfect good. Rather, it unsettles the will with worries about coups, plots, misdealings, and assassinations. Therefore, happiness is not power. The second argument is this: happiness is the last or final end of action. Power is not the last end of action, but rather a principle or source of action. Therefore, happiness is not power. Now, to understand this last argument, consider that the person who is a political ruler is a political ruler, that is, they have power precisely because they're able to command other people to do certain things, and as a result, you will have combined or coordinated actions resulting from their political office. Thus, their power or political office is a principle of action, which is itself ordered to some further actuality, namely the activity which is coordinated by means of their power. But happiness is the last end, so it's not a principle of action, but rather that in which action must culminate. So power cannot be happiness. A third argument is this: happiness is the perfect good, but power is related indifferently to both good and evil. There are both good political rulers and bad political rulers, good workers at the DMV and bad workers at the DMV. Both have power, but they're indifferently related to good and bad. Therefore, happiness is not power. Now, wealth, honor, fame, and power are all external goods, as we said before. Now that we've looked at these external goods and shown that none of them is that in which happiness consists, we'll turn to intrinsic goods of the body, like health and beauty on the one hand, and pleasure on the other. The first argument that the existence of the body, which consists in maintaining one's health, is not that in which happiness consists is this: if something is for something else as its end, then that last end cannot consist in the preservation of the being of that thing. For instance, a boat exists for the sake of navigation, so the last end of the boat's captain cannot be the mere preservation of the existence or integrity of the boat. But a human does not exist for his or her own sake, but for something else as his or her end. We see this because if we did exist for our own sake, then our will would be satisfied with our mere existence. We wouldn't go out for anything beyond ourselves. Evidently, however, we aren't necessarily moved towards something outside of ourselves. We're not satisfied with merely existing. Therefore, happiness does not consist in the preservation of the existence of the human through the preservation of bodily integrity or health. Now, a second argument is this. Even if the end of a human did consist in the mere existence of the human, which we've just said is false, but even if that were the case, it would still not consist in the existence of the body. Since, as Aquinas proved earlier in the Summa Theologiae, specifically in Prima Pars question 75, the soul has an operation, that is, understanding, which does not depend on the body, and thus the soul can exist separately from the body. To put this in simpler terms, the human is not just body, but body and soul. So, if it's the case, which we've said is false, but if it's the case that a human's goal was merely maintaining his own existence, then still his end would not be maintaining the existence specifically of the body, but rather of the soul, since the soul is that which maintains the existence of the human, and the soul is independent of the human body. Here Aquinas is bringing in a premise which he hasn't proved here, but which he proved earlier in the Summa Theologiae. So these two arguments show us, by working with one another, that the good of the human person, his ultimate end or happiness, does not consist in the integrity of the body or health, which is what preserves the existence of the body, but rather it must consist in something else. Now that we've seen that happiness does not consist in external goods of fortune like wealth, honor, celebrity, or political power, and we've also seen that happiness does not consist in the bodily integrity, which is called health, or in the preservation of the body, now let's look at perhaps the most persuasive fool's gold happiness, namely pleasure. Pleasure is the thing that most people confuse with happiness, if they're going to confuse anything with happiness at all. Now, there are different kinds of pleasure, ranging from intellectual pleasures, purely so-called, and bodily pleasures. So, intellectual pleasures would be things like the joy of understanding a certain proof or demonstration in a scientific investigation. For instance, when something is discovered scientifically, that might result in a certain intellectual pleasure. Some people even enjoy or take pleasure in learning geometry. That is intellectual pleasure. On the other extreme, there are bodily pleasures, like the pleasure of eating pancakes. That is a bodily pleasure. In the middle, you find things like the pleasure of listening to certain forms of music. This is on the border of being an intellectual pleasure, but it also has a bodily component. So there are all sorts of different pleasures, and if you take the word pleasure to include all of these, then it's quite persuasive to say that happiness is pleasure, or that pleasure is the concrete reality in which happiness is found. Now, the most famous defender of this view is the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who lived from 1806 to 1873. John Stuart Mill emphasized that pleasure is the highest good, the summum bonum. It's that which all people desire, and he identified pleasure with happiness. Moreover, in order to respond to objectors who would say that it's rather base or lowly to identify happiness with pleasure, he said, well, pleasure doesn't just mean bodily pleasures, it also means intellectual pleasures, or the pleasure of listening to beautiful music. So it's not at all base to say that pleasure is happiness, or pleasure is the highest good. Now, there are a few arguments we can make against saying that pleasure is the highest good or happiness. The first argument is this. Pleasure of any kind cannot itself be happiness, but some kind of pleasure may be a necessary result of happiness. So here we're drawing a distinction between what is that in which happiness actually consists and what necessarily results from happiness. will grant that perhaps there's some kind of pleasure which necessarily results from happiness, but call into question the idea that pleasure itself is that in which happiness consists. To see this, note that pleasure is the movement of the appetite, either the sensible appetite or the will, which results from the apprehensive faculty perceiving something good as being present, either in reality, as when the sense of taste perceives that a hamburger, which is actually being chewed, is good, or in hope, as when one takes pleasure in thoughts of the meal he is going to have later that day, or in memory, as when one takes pleasure in one's memories or reminiscences on good past times. So again, pleasure is the movement of the appetite after one of the apprehensive faculties, such as the sense powers, especially the inner senses, or the intellect, has perceived some good as being present, either in reality, in hope, or in memory. But happiness does not result from some other good. Rather, happiness is what is good in its own right. That's just the definition of happiness. Therefore, happiness is not pleasure. Rather, pleasure is something that results as a necessary consequence of knowing oneself to be happy, that is, to have some good being present. So, notice that there are several components to this argument. First, you must have some good which is present to you, and then one of your apprehensive powers, such as your inner senses or your intellect, perceives that the good is present, either in reality, in hope, or in memory. This perception of the good being present is what causes the movement of the appetite, either of the sensible appetite or of the will, towards that good, and this movement is called pleasure. So the pleasure is rather far along in the series of events. Before the pleasure, there must be some prior good. So pleasure itself is only good insofar as there's some more fundamental good which has become present. But happiness is the most fundamental good. It's not good by relation to anything else. Therefore, pleasure, which is good by relation to something else, is not happiness, but rather a consequence of happiness, at best. Now, on the last page, we gave an argument that was general to all pleasure, whether intellectual or purely bodily or somewhere in between. On this page, we're going to look at specifically sensible pleasure. Now, usually when someone says pleasure without qualification, not saying something like intellectual pleasure, but they just say pleasure, what they mean is sensible or bodily pleasure. That is, the sort of pleasure that results from eating food or from sexual intercourse or some other bodily activity. Aquinas argued earlier in the Summa Theologiae, in Prima Pars question 75, that the operations of the human soul go beyond those that require a bodily organ. Understanding and will are both activities done by the soul that don't rely on any part of the body. Thus, the bodily senses cannot apprehend the good that is proper to human nature, since this good transcends the body. Thus, the pleasure resulting from senses apprehending particular things as good cannot be the sort of pleasure that accompanies man's ultimate good, namely happiness. In summary, pleasure is at best a natural result of happiness, not happiness itself. But bodily pleasure cannot even be the proper natural result of happiness, since it results only from what the sense powers perceive as good, and the sense powers cannot apprehend the perfect good of human nature, which necessarily transcends the body. So it's neither the case that intellectual pleasures nor sensible bodily pleasures are the ultimate good, called happiness. Nevertheless, it's possible, and quite plausible, that intellectual pleasures of some kinds are the necessary result of happiness. So when one achieves happiness, there will be pleasure, but the pleasure itself is a response to the happiness, not the happiness itself. Bodily pleasures cannot be the natural proper natural result of happiness. They might accompany happiness in some sense, but they're not the natural result proportionate to happiness, since they pertain to bodily goods, whereas happiness must transcend the body. So now we've seen that wealth, honor, fame, and power are not happiness. Those were all external goods or goods of fortune. We've also seen that bodily goods, that is, the health or integrity of the body, and pleasure are not happiness either. So we've moved from external goods to intrinsic bodily goods, and now we're going to ascend to the goods of the soul, namely virtue. Is virtue happiness? You might be surprised that both St. Thomas and Aristotle say that virtue is not that in which happiness consists. It might sound lofty to say that virtue is that in which happiness consists, but that's still false. Here, we'll quote Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. Quote, "But it makes perhaps no small difference whether we place the chief good in possession or in use, in habit or in activity. For a virtuous habit may exist without producing any good result, as in a man who is asleep and in some other way quite inactive. But the activity cannot. For one who has the activity will of necessity be acting, and acting well. And as in the Olympic Games, it is not the most beautiful and the strongest that are crowned, but those who compete. For it is some of these that are victorious. So those who act rightly win the noble and good things in life." End quote. Now let's break down Aristotle's argument. Potency is not the last end, but is ordered to something further, namely act. But a habit, or virtue, and here virtue just means a good habit, is a kind of potency. Therefore, happiness, which is the last end, is not virtue. Now, why do we say that virtue is a potency? Well, it's a potency because virtue is a good habit, but a habit is an inclination to act. It's a disposition whereby you're going to act in a certain way. So if you have a good habit, you're inclined to act well. But a disposition, by definition, is ordered to something further, namely the act which results from the disposition. So happiness, which is the last end, cannot be virtue. At best, it will be the thing that results from virtue. As we'll see in another video, that is in fact the case. Now, a second argument is also found in Aristotle's quotation above. This argument is intended to confirm the first argument by an analogy to the Olympic Games. Honor, as we've seen previously, is a reward given to a perceived excellence or virtue. But we don't honor the one who merely has the most virtue, that is, the most strength or agility or any other kind of perfection, but only the one who acts on it, the one who wins the competition. Someone who is stronger than the rest but sits out the whole game is not honored with a trophy. Likewise, someone who has virtue but is asleep his whole life or inactive doesn't deserve to be honored as a happy person. Therefore, happiness does not consist in virtue. So these are the two basic arguments that you could find in that last paragraph we read from Aristotle. In summary, neither wealth, nor honor, nor fame, nor power, nor health, nor pleasure, nor virtue is that concrete reality in which happiness consists. In what then does happiness consist? Can anything at all be that in which happiness is concretely realized? Both of these questions will come to mind since we've eliminated so many of the things which seem plausibly to be that in which happiness consists, and in doing so we've seemed to set the bar so high for happiness that nothing could attain it. So in a later video we'll have to ask, what does happiness consist in, and is there anything in which we can find happiness?